Chapter 255 of JJK has been leaked, and it's getting harder every single week to find these leaks. Because, and feel free to call me weird here, but I like to see the pictures of the story I'm reading, and I like for the little bubbles where they're doing the talking bits to be translated into a language I understand. However, nowadays, the only way to consistently find leaks is to wait on a Twitter page at midnight my time and slowly read what's happening in that chapter, one tweet at a time. So for the past couple of months since I've been covering JJK's manga leaks, I've been waiting until the next day because usually the good leaks were out by then. But Japan started sending people to jail. So now I'm deeper in Reddit forums than I've ever been before on the sketchiest websites I can possibly find on my work computer, all to read raw scans with AI translations. But I'm doing it. I'm doing it for you because I love you. Mwah. And a lot happened in chapter 255, at least what I could suss out from this translation. We got to see the true capacity of Miguel's curse technique. LaRue burst back onto the stage. Do you remember who LaRue is? Probably not, but I'm gonna remind you. Maki is still alive. Yuji burst back into the fight. Chozo's shooting blood. And oh, yeah, they're all probably gonna die. And if they do, could that possibly spell the ending for JJK, both as a story and as a fandom? Because I believe, whether or not you believe that Chapter 255 was important from a story standpoint, I believe the possible shift that Chapter 255 could denote to the fandom as a whole is a make or break moment. See, the JJK fandom has begun to coin a new term, the Sukuna cycle, where for the last year or so, it's felt as though we've gotten a new fighter to burst onto the stage to battle against Sukuna, just to have that character hyped up, given a slight chance in the battle against Sukuna, and then be summarily defeated. Because of the perpetual nature of the Sukuna cycle, the JJK fandom is starting to get a little upset. And thus I've seen the public perception of this manga begin to dip rather substantially, which is kind of how these things tend to happen. Like it or not, most people want a happy ending, and when they don't get it, well, the pitchforks start to come out. And therefore, while this chapter may not have technically accomplished all that much, I believe that Chapter 255 has set up Chapter 256 to either be the chapter that puts the final nail in JJK's coffin, or the chapter that rises it from the ashes. And thus today we have a lot more to talk about than just the events of Chapter 255, as we also have to talk about the gripes that the JJK fandom is having with the manga's current state, and how the future of the JJK manga, Chapter 256, could either assuage those gripes or solidify them forever. So like it or not, from either a plot or real-world perspective, Miguel holds the fate of JJK in his very hands. And based off some comments we got from Gojo in this chapter, that idea may be worse than death for him, because Gojo might be slightly racist. But if you've heard any stories from black people in Japan, considering the fact that Gojo is Japanese, that's not that surprising. So today we got a whole lot more than just a dive into a chapter. We have an introspective look into the future of JJK and what that could mean for the fandom. So we got a big one to film today. So with no further ado, let's get into Chapter 255 Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me covering your favorite anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, The Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you just want to look like you're somebody who keeps up with all things anime and manga, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. But before we get into all that, today we got to talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Factor. Factor wants to help you crush your nutrition goals leading into summer this year. And they want to do that by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals to your doorstep every single week. Because their team of gourmet chefs create meals with only the finest ingredients to make sure when you're fueling up on Factor, you always feel your best. But Factor wants more than just you feeling your best. They also want you to have as much free time as possible, which is why all of their meals are heat and eat ready in just 2 minutes. Yes, that's right, you can have restaurant quality meals wherever you are. But Factor does a lot more than just 2-minute microwavable gourmet meals. They also have snacks, smoothies, and much more. And with Factor, you can discover a wide variety of easy options to eat throughout your day, like breakfast, midday bites, and so much more. And the convenience and taste of Factor is a massive game changer in my everyday life. On an average weekday, I go on a run, work out, and film 2 YouTube videos. Trying to figure out what I want to eat for lunch, and then worse, trying to figure out how to cook said lunch, is just time I don't have. And that's where Factor comes into play. Every single week, they give me dietitian-approved delicious meals that I can have ready in 2 minutes, so I can go downstairs, have a 10-minute lunch, and then get back to work. Because being as consistent a poster as I am is a lot of work. But enough talking about how incredible Factor is. Let me show you.
Today we're cooking up roasted veggie and pesto tortellini. I love a healthy and hearty Italian meal.
And look at how easy this is. All I have to do is remove that film, poke a couple of holes in this foil here, toss in the microwave, hit 2, and I'll see you in 120 seconds. And look at how good that looks. But let's see how good it tastes.
The pesto flavoring is perfect, and the pasta is somehow still perfectly al dente.
What are you waiting for? Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code TWC50 to get 50% off your first order and free wellness shots for life. 2 free wellness shots from 3 available flavors for every order while you are an active subscriber. Yes, again, that's factor75.com or click the link below and use code TWC50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and free wellness shots for life. Factor. Convenience, not compromise. So before we can talk about the future that Chapter 255 is setting up for the JJK universe, we gotta talk about what happened in Chapter 255. And Chapter 255 started out in a way that a lot of us didn't see coming. See, because while the end of Chapter 254 had showed us that we had been saved by Miguel, and therefore Miguel was Sukuna's next opponent, Chapter 255 doesn't just open with Miguel staring down Sukuna. No, there's somebody else there, and that somebody else is LaRue. Now, for those of you who don't remember LaRue, can't blame you. The last time that we saw LaRue was Chapter 0, as LaRue was essentially one of Kenjaku's generals, much in the same capacity that Miguel was. However, LaRue didn't have a moment in JJK where he was getting pimp slapped by Gojo, and thus LaRue left a much smaller impression on the JJK fandom as a whole. However, what's important to remember about Chapter 0 is that basically all of Kenjaku's generals survive his attack, as Kenjaku's daughters survive until the Shibuya incident where they're killed by Sukuna, and Miguel and LaRue are spared. In the opening panel of Chapter 255 shows a lot more than just LaRue standing behind Miguel. It also shows a giant hand holding on to Kusakabe, who, still doesn't look great. But who does this giant hand belong to? Is it Rika? No, it's LaRue, whose curse technique gets explained later in the chapter, so we'll cover it when we get to that part of the chapter. After the reveal of LaRue and Miguel standing opposed to Sukuna, we get a flashback that presumably happened during the 1-month time skip between Gojo being unsealed and the beginning of Gojo versus Sukuna's battle. And apparently during this 1-month time skip, Yuta took a trip back to Africa to ask Miguel to join in the battle against Sukuna. Now I say back to Africa because after the events of Chapter 0, Yuta was sent to Africa to train with Miguel, which is why Yuta was the liaison to try and recruit Miguel into the Kusakabe coalition. However, this flashback shows that Miguel doesn't want to battle against Sukuna, as when Yuta asks Miguel to join the Kusakabe coalition, he says, "I don't want to. An opponent that might be able to defeat Gojo, hard pass," which is fair because he didn't stand a chance against Gojo. However, Yuta isn't the only person trying to convince Miguel to join in the battle against Sukuna, as LaRue is also there, surprisingly wearing a shirt, which is new for LaRue because usually all we see is the heart-shaped nipple pasties, which could also just be his nipples. You never know. It's anime. However, even though Miguel is saying that he doesn't want to battle against Sukuna, LaRue and Yuta are telling him that if he doesn't battle against Sukuna and Sukuna wins and starts the merger with Tengen, that the fallout of the Japanese populace merging with Tengen will eventually reach his front door. Kind of like the rest of the world asking for America's help in World War II. Sure, the Germans aren't on your beaches quite yet, but if you don't resist, they might be one day. But to this, Miguel says, even if some Godzilla-like cursed spirit ends up on my front doorstep one day, I think that'll be better than dealing with Sukuna. That is to say that Miguel's saying he would rather fight against Super Tengen than Sukuna, and Miguel continues to push back against Yuta, going so far as to state that if Yuta is going to apologize for how Miguel was treated during Chapter 0, that he should show more respect, to which Yuta responds by saying, "Do you want me to prostrate myself?" Essentially saying, "Do you want me to get down on my hands and knees and apologize?" in the most formal sense. Now, throughout this conversation, Miguel is being incredibly sassy to Yuta, presumably because of the closeness of their relationship that they grew over the time that Yuta spent in Africa training with Miguel. And LaRue sees that this conversation isn't really going anywhere, and thus he pulls Yuta to the side and says, "Can I have a moment to talk to Miguel?" At which point Yuta steps away, and Miguel asks LaRue, "What are you gonna do?" To which LaRue responds by looking back at the past, telling Miguel that he's just like he is. Back in the day, that is Chapter 0, he just wanted to make Kenjaku king, because that was the goal of both Miguel and LaRue. They believed in Kenjaku's mission, and their singular motivation in life was to make Kenjaku's mission become reality. However, after Kenjaku's death, they kind of lost their way, to which Miguel responds by saying, hey, I did my part. I fought for him during Chapter 0, or the Night of 1,000 Curses, I believe it was called. And thus Miguel says that he feels no more obligation to be involved in the happenings of Japan. Kind of like he's been burned once, he doesn't feel the necessity to be burned again. To which LaRue responds by saying, you and me and the rest of Kenjaku's generals just liked him, implying that that's why they all went along with the idea of the Night of 1,000 Curses. So Miguel asks LaRue, is this all about revenge? Do you want to go back to Japan to get revenge for the death of Kenjaku? Or do you possibly want to get Geto's body back from Kenjaku? I just realized I've been referring to Geto as Kenjaku this entire time. It's been switched in my brain. I'm sorry, I've been conditioned. It's been so long since I've had to refer to him as Geto. So yeah, he asks LaRue if he wants to get Geto's body back from Kenjaku. But LaRue says it's not about either of those things. He says he simply wants to mourn Geto's life. He says he wants to go to Geto's grave and have a meal to wish Geto peace in the afterlife. He wants to send Geto off to heaven in hopes that one day they can follow him there. And this kind of convinces Miguel, even though Miguel says no matter how you look at it, Geto is in hell. He says, fine, I'll go to Japan, but I have conditions. Miguel says that he'll only step into the battle against Sukuna if A, Gojo loses, and B, Sukuna no longer has the ability to use his domain. And his last stipulation is that LaRue has to go with him, as Miguel tells LaRue that the more friends there, the better. We then cut back to the present, where Miguel, looking down upon Sukuna, says he's unable to use his domain expansion, which is a nice present from Gojo in the afterlife, as the reason that Sukuna can't use his domain expansion right now is because in the battle of domains he had against Gojo, he fried that part of his brain. On top of this, LaRue states that Sukuna's reverse curse technique is also heavily hampered. As it currently stands, Sukuna still only has 3 hands and an incurable heart. Now Sukuna, as we already know, cut off one of his 4 hands because the executioner blade was about to come into contact with that hand, and if it did while it was still attached to him, it would have killed him instantly. So Sukuna still hasn't healed from that injury, and he still hasn't healed the injury that Maki was able to inflict upon him with her blade that destroyed his heart. 1, because his reverse curse technique is hampered, and 2, because of how her curse tool works, in that wounds inflicted by it are harder to heal. At which point Miguel says, I'm starting to feel a little sorry. It's like taking the best part, because he's coming in at the end of the battle, and if he wins, we'll get all of the glory. But it's still going to be an uphill battle, because at this moment, Sukuna launches a massive dismantle at both Miguel and LaRue, and after that, he makes a beeline for LaRue. However, LaRue is able to stop Sukuna in his tracks with his curse technique, slamming him into the wall so hard that it leaves a crater in the shape of a hand in the wall. However, Sukuna quickly bounces back and launches a dismantle at LaRue. And as LaRue blocks the dismantle with his arms, Miguel pops out from behind him, closing the distance between himself and Sukuna. But Sukuna, not wanting anybody close to him, launches a series of dismantles at Miguel, which he, I shit you not, break dances around. Like the full-on sweeping leg kick thing, a headstand, he jumps between different dismantles. We're talking Red Bull competition level breakdancing. Because of this, he's able to close the distance between himself and Sukuna, and he begins to land some close blows, some kicks, some punches, and LaRue, who was behind all the dismantles that Miguel was dodging, used his curse technique to pull himself out of the way. Now, to this point, that LaRue's curse technique is revealed, and it's a rather simple one. Essentially, LaRue is able to create massive ethereal hands, but the hands are physical. Ethereal probably isn't the right word. They're just giant cursed energy hands that are separated from his body and thus can be controlled remotely. Kind of like Master Hand in Smash Bros. If Master Hand was being controlled by a man with nipple pasties, which they could be. And LaRue is able to make these hands infinitely. And these hands can be destroyed because they're able to interact with physical objects like Sukuna. And if these hands are destroyed, LaRue receives 1/10 of the damage inflicted upon the hands. So if 100 damage in the medium of a dismantle is inflicted upon the hands and it destroys it, LaRue receives 10 damage, 10%. Now, as to whether or not that damage is inflicted to LaRue's entire body or just his hands, we can't necessarily say. The translation I'm reading says the damage is inflicted to the real body, so I'm assuming it's his whole body. But that is to say that 10 of these LaRue hands have to be destroyed in order for LaRue to receive the damage of a full attack. So if LaRue would be able to withstand 2 dismantles without dying, then he should be able to use at least 20 iterations of these hands. So all in all, a pretty good curse technique, nothing mind-boggling, and the power and size of these hands appears to be enough to do some combat with Sukuna, so it makes him a fair to mid-level contestant against Sukuna, but he is not the star of this show. No, that would be Miguel, whose curse technique is explained directly after LaRue's. See, Miguel's curse technique is known as Hakuna Lana, or as it's directly translated into English, Prayer Beast. A curse technique carved into Miguel's flesh that repels curses and enhances Miguel's physical attributes. But how does it accomplish all this? Well, essentially the curse technique, and buckle up for this one, allows for Miguel to be able to catch a rhythm. And by using his curse energy to catch the rhythm of the battle, presumably, Miguel is able to dodge curses and enhance his physical abilities. Now, I have some thoughts about that, but so does the JJK universe. Now, the real breakdown we get of this curse technique actually comes through the medium of a flashback with Gojo walking around with Yuta and Miguel, and presumably Africa, where Gojo was explaining to Yuta how Miguel's curse technique works. I don't know why Miguel wasn't doing the explaining, but whatever. Gojo is explaining to Yuta that Miguel's curse technique works by giving himself and his enemy buffs and debuffs, all without the usage of a domain expansion. And while that in itself is impressive, it's nothing all that scary. Now, Gojo presumably figured this out in his battle against Miguel. This is also presumably how Miguel was able to survive his bout with Gojo, as we've seen one punch from Gojo wipe out people of presumed equal strength to Miguel, and therefore Miguel, using this curse technique against Gojo and therefore buffing his own physical abilities and debuffing Gojo's, presumably would have taken some of the oomph out of Gojo's punches, therefore allowing Miguel to still be breathing after the literal ass whooping that Gojo put on him. And this is backed up in Chapter 0 when Gojo even goes so far as to say that Miguel is pretty tough. And that's fair, because if anybody else took the whooping that Gojo laid down on Miguel, they probably wouldn't be walking around, let alone in a position to teach one of his students. Now, does this mean that Miguel would have been able to tank something like a purple or a domain expansion or even a red? Probably not. But since Gojo decided to go with violence and use his fists in the battle against Miguel, Miguel's technique shined and saved his life. And therefore, in a sense, Miguel's curse technique kind of works like Tengen's sound breathing in Demon Slayer, where throughout the course of the fight, Miguel is able to pick up on the rhythm of the person he's battling in order to boost his technique further and figure out how the person he's battling against battles, allowing Miguel to eventually find a gap that he can exploit. After this, Gojo decides to jump into a little eugenics, where he states that Miguel, comparatively to a Japanese sorcerer, is a little bit of a threat. See, Gojo says the loud part a little bit quietly when he says that 99.9% of sorcerers are Japanese, and therefore, because they're Japanese, they have to use their cursed energy to strengthen themselves. Gojo says because of Miguel's rare skeletal structure, he's able to achieve the level of strength that Japanese sorcerers have to ascend to through the usage of cursed energy naturally, which is a really nice 2018 version of saying because Miguel is black, he's stronger than your average Japanese sorcerer. Because black strong, Asian less strong. Now you could say that Gojo came to this opinion because Miguel is the only sorcerer he knows outside of the confines of Japan, and Miguel doesn't fall into a similar categorization as all the other sorcerers that Gojo knows, but it's kind of like people looking at professional sports leagues and being like, oh wow, it's majority black. It must be because black people are faster and stronger than all other races, which has never been scientifically backed by anything. And actually the prevalence of black people in sports leagues comes from the fact that society gives less options to ascending beyond their means to people that are black than as opposed to all other races. And therefore a much higher level of importance is put on sports in black communities than other communities. It has nothing to do with black people having an extra bone in their body, which is something that I was taught as a child that is not true, and is kind of what Gojo is referencing in this moment. But Miguel kind of calls Gojo out here, saying that the reason that I'm athletic is not because I'm black, I'm athletic because I'm me, which is awesome. Good job, Gege. But at the same time, small problem. Well, I get that Miguel standing up against the presumed racism of Gojo is important culturally, especially from a Japanese piece of media. And like, Japanese people aren't racist, but like, they're pretty racist, especially towards black people, at least historically. So seeing this kind of growth in the most popular story and the most popular form of media in Japan is cool to see. We did, give the one black character breakdancing abilities. Like, yeah, his curse technique is rhythm, which a lot of people are going to be like,
oh, but other characters like Tengen have rhythm-based abilities.
Yeah, I think we could acknowledge the fact that the context is a little bit different between Tengen and Miguel. So, one step forward, half step back. He could have had anything except for lightning-based abilities. We we've beaten that trope to death. But Gojo apologizes and Yuta goes, it's the same Gojo, the head of the clan. Essentially, Yuta's embarrassed of his teacher. And after Yuta's done being all bashful and embarrassed, Miguel says that when it comes down to linear movements devoid of cursed technique, there's probably nobody on Earth who can match him. But in terms of pinpoint movements, he's not nearly as quick as he is with his linear movements. That is to say that Miguel's admitting that while he's able to close the distance and dodge attacks very easily, the accuracy of his strikes may be a little bit lacking. However, this doesn't appear to really be the case, because after this conversation is done, we cut back to the present, where Miguel is blocking two of Sukuna's arms and then landing a vicious body shot directly to Sukuna's gaping chest wound, which launches Sukuna backwards towards a shadowy figure that launches a stream of condensed blood at Sukuna. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, Chozo has rejoined the battle. However, Sukuna is able to dodge the stream of blood, and he turns around and launches a dismantle at Chozo, which he blocks. Now, it's important to note here that all the dismantles that are hitting people seem to be rather easily blocked with their arms, which is consistent with everything that we saw in Yuta's domain. That is to say that Sukuna is losing control of Megami as a vessel, and therefore his AP is dipping, and thus the cutting power of his dismantle is also dipping. But Chozo isn't the only person who's broken back onto the stage, because if we remember, the last time we saw Chozo, he was helping a certain brother of his learn how to breathe real good. And thus, from the sky, Yuji descends and lands a smash on Sukuna. A smash delivered with so much force that the ground below Sukuna craters. And upon receiving this smash, Sukuna wonders, is there still one left? Presumably talking about how Sukuna is aware that there's one more fighter coming in to try and kill him, outside of Chozo and Yuji. It's at this point that the narrator gives us a little bit of exposition, that in order for Sukuna to release the slash that severs the world that he used against Gojo and Hikaruma and possibly Kusakabe, he needs to use the Enma 10 hand seal, because as we know, high-level jujutsu techniques require chants and hand seals, which is why Sukuna in his true form is considered to be the perfect sorcerer, as he has 2 mouths and 4 hands. But currently, the version of Sukuna that we have has 1 mouth and 3 hands. However, so long as Sukuna has 2 hands on opposite sides of his body, he can do the Enma 10 hand seal, which would allow for him to launch the 1 slash that can kill all the people that he's fighting. So if you want to limit Sukuna's arsenal, limit his hands. And that is exactly what the one more is coming to do, because guess who's still alive? Maki. Yes, Maki bursts back onto the scene with a big old smile on her face, looking none the worse from her battle against Sukuna, which makes sense because while Maki wasn't healed by Shoko and doesn't have reverse curse technique because she doesn't have cursed energy, it was revealed a little while back because of her heavenly restriction, her body is able to heal itself much faster than anybody else's. As the last time that Maki got injured, I believe it was in the battle against Sukuna, Maki said that she just needed 5 minutes to heal her body. And since it's maybe been that long, who knows how long Kusakabe held the line, Maki is apparently back to fullish health. And so what does Maki do when she returns to the scene? Well, she cuts off the other hand that's on the side of the hand that Sukuna has already sliced off, leaving Sukuna with 2 hands on the same side. And since Sukuna is currently incapable of using reverse curse technique, especially when it comes to wounds that come from Maki's cursed tool, the split soul katana, as it's able to resist all physical defense and cut the soul directly, and healing through the usage of reverse curse technique requires knowing the exact shape of your soul, it appears as though Sukuna will now no longer be able to use the slash that severs the world, which means that Sukuna is left with only dismantle, the technique that everybody seems to be able to tank, for like 2 seconds. Because in the literal next page, Sukuna, after getting one of his hands cut off, just turns around and black flashes Laru. And I don't know if you guys remember the rule from Gojo's battle against Sukuna, but basically after Gojo and Sukuna had their domain clash battle, after Gojo hit 2 consecutive black flashes, he was able to regain his ability to use reverse curse technique, which gave him an inherent advantage against Sukuna down the line in their battle. Now this is because pulling off a black flash is so incredibly difficult that when it's pulled off, it spikes your cursed energy. And thus, since just I believe 2 chapters ago, Sukuna hit a black flash against Maki, this second black flash that he just landed against Laru places him at that great old number of 2. The chapter ends by saying that Gojo Satoru only needed 2 black flashes to restore his reverse curse technique, and thus the Curse King has, and that's the end. Cliffhanger. But let me tell you right now, there's a good chance he gets reverse curse technique back. And if he gets reverse curse technique back, he gets his hands back, and he gets his heart back, and he gets the part of his brain back that allows him to open domains. And nobody that Sukuna is currently battling against has a domain expansion. And while some of them might have simple domains, there's a reason that Miguel stated, I'm only jumping into this battle against Sukuna after his domain expansion is gone, because the second that domain expansion happens, good night, sweet prince. And thus it appears as though chapter 255 has done the same thing that the last 30 or so chapters have done to JJK. We have re-entered the Sukuna cycle. Sukuna fought a new enemy in chapter 254, who got hyped up and landed some attacks. However, Sukuna overcame him and the story didn't progress. And now, in chapter 255, it's revealed that Chozo, Yuji, and Maki are still on the scene, but they're also being helped by the likes of LaRue and Miguel, who are now landing hits against Sukuna, hitting his heart and cutting his hands off. But at the end of chapter 255, it appears as though Sukuna is once again getting the upper hand. And if Sukuna gets his domain expansion back, then the Sukuna cycle continues, as everybody within a 200-meter radius, which is everybody who's currently fighting against Sukuna, would be caught in his domain and summarily sliced to pieces. And thus all of the hope built up in chapter 255 is once again destroyed in chapter 256. So where is this story heading? Well, fortunately, it's pretty easy to tell, because there's really only two things that can happen. Either chapter 256 can open with Sukuna recovering his domain expansion, his hands and his heart, or somehow Gege can explain that Gojo's more talented at recovering his reverse curse technique than Sukuna was, and Sukuna's gonna need more than 2 black flashes, at which point the remaining fighters in the Kusakabe coalition may be able to actually stand a chance against Sukuna. And depending on which direction Gege goes, I believe will hold a massive amount of sway to his fan base's opinions. Because here's the thing, I like the brutalism of JJK's current direction, but even I have to admit that it's getting a bit repetitive at this point. Let's quickly go over all the people who have stepped into battle against Sukuna. It opens with Gojo, obviously, and that fight was incredible. I mean, Gojo gets off-screened, which a lot of people didn't approve of, and I still don't necessarily understand, but the shock value was pretty incredible, and people talked about it for months. Immediately after that, Higuruma and Yuji jump into the fray, presumably with the idea of stripping Sukuna from his curse technique, the Shrine. However, that fight ends with a domain expansion going the exact way that Higuruma and Yuji wanted to go, but a new rule gets added that the first thing that confiscation will take is a cursed tool and not a cursed technique, which I thought was silly. But I think we all knew at that point that defeating Sukuna wasn't going to be that simple, and thus the long-awaited battle between Higuruma, Yuji, and Sukuna boils down to Sukuna losing a cursed tool he hasn't even used yet. Because, and I can't believe I forgot this, never mind, yes I can, Sukuna also wasn't able to use his cursed tool in his battle against Kashima, who jumped in directly after the battle against Gojo, and unveiled an incredible new cursed technique in form and his mythical beast Amber. Kashima, just like Gojo, also gets off-screened. Higuruma then gets confiscation and the Executioner Blade, and is able to stand toe-to-toe against Sukuna, who says that he's a genius on par with Gojo in terms of his curse technique output and application, just for Higuruma to get the X to death, throw the Executioner Blade to Yuji, and then Yuji to not be able to stab Sukuna with it. Now, mind you, all of this is after Higuruma believed he was going to kill Sukuna because he lands an attack with the Executioner Blade onto Sukuna's hand. But Higuruma gets cut down. But don't worry, there's more fighters, and those more fighters are Yuta, presumably the second strongest person left in the Kusakabe coalition after Gojo. And Yuta opens a domain, quite possibly the strongest domain we've ever seen outside of something like Malevolent Shrine, with the innate technique applied to it being Jacob's goddamn ladder, the thing that destroyed the prison realm. And Sukuna gets hit with a full-powered Jacob's ladder, the thing that's supposed to destroy cursed spirits and objects. And what does it do to Sukuna? It only makes an opening for Yuji to punch him in the stomach and have a brief conversation with Megami, after which Yuta is possibly killed with the X of Death. But don't worry, Maki's in the wins, and she's got a big old smile, and she just destroyed Sukuna's heart, which means nothing. And Maki is defeated in 1 chapter. But don't worry, Kusakabe's in the wins, and his simple domain works in the craziest way we've ever seen, and he gets the X of Death in an off-screen moment. But don't worry, Miguel and LaRue are in the wings, and they're way stronger than we even realized, just like Kusakabe. But now Sukuna gets the thing back that Miguel specifically didn't want him to have, and thus Miguel and LaRue and possibly Chozo and Maki all die. And while if you're gonna hype up a character to be the strongest character in the history of Japan, this is the kind of devastation you would expect them to unfurl. The repetitiveness of the writing is starting to get a bit stale. So the question that has to be asked is, what is Gege trying to accomplish here? Did he write himself into a corner when he cut out characters like Gojo and Todo, fan favorites who the community wanted to see more of, and yet he somewhat refused to give us? Characters who were written to be incredibly important in the beginning stages of JJK, who have now since disappeared. As Todo, possibly the community's favorite character, was written out of the story almost entirely after the Shibuya incident, and Gojo was written out of the story through a slash, which the community still disagrees with. So is the idea to have Sukuna win? Maybe. But if the idea is to have Sukuna win, why include Miguel and LaRue and Kusakabe? Why continually get our hopes up just to have them squashed in a somewhat repetitive cycle in order to display the complete and total dominance that Sukuna at full power has? Maybe, but undeniably you have to admit that Sukuna's gotten lucky more than a couple times. Well, a lot of Sukuna winning all these battles does boil down to his skill. Those skills come about in such a way that the entire community's favorite joke currently is, my blank skill. I haven't used that since the Heian era. As Sukuna, for some reason or another, every single chapter seems to have some convenient ability to squeak out of a situation. A level of convenience that isn't applied to any other character in the story. And thus, while Sukuna's power is undeniable, there's times where he just feels like an OC insert into the story. And while suffering has been a major theme for Yuji throughout the entirety of the story, for the last 30 or 40 chapters, it's felt as though we've spent more time focused on Sukuna than Yuji, the main character of the story. We still don't even know what's going on with Yuji's arms, and yet we're taking time to explain LaRue's curse technique and Miguel's breakdancing ability. So while the brutality that Gege is approaching this storyline with is new and interesting, and will definitely leave a mark in the manga community for years to come, there's a lot of people in the community who think that Gege unfortunately wrote himself into a corner that he can't quite figure how to get out of, because his inability to expound on Yuji's abilities and give him any character development doesn't make him an MC capable of defeating the superhero villain he's created, and thus he needs a perpetual cycle of people who are for some reason all prepared to battle against Sukuna in order to come in and weaken Sukuna. But then you work your way down a list of characters that gets less and less relevant by the chapter until eventually there's a man with heart-shaped pasties battling your self-insert OC, which probably explains why characters like Chozo and Maki were able to bounce back, because they're the only relevant characters left in the story outside of Yuji. But genuinely, as I sit here, I don't think that Maki, Yuji, and Chozo have enough power or enough clout within their own story to defeat Sukuna. And if Sukuna is able to recover his RCT, the idea of being able to reach to Megami inside of Sukuna is all but gone. As if he's able to heal all the corners of his soul, he'd be able to re-strengthen himself as a vessel. And the entire idea behind the Kusakabe coalition was to whittle down his strength and have Yuji reach out to Megami and have Megami retake over his body, which many believe would arise Megami as the final big bad of the story, who Yuji would have to battle against in a one-on-one where one of them died, truly cementing Yuji's final suffering arc. But the story could also go in another way, where Sukuna actually wins and initiates the merger, but through some means, Yuji is able to control Super Tengen and battle against Sukuna as the host of the Hive Mind, the real reason Kenjaku made him in the first place. But the more and more you think about the possibility of Yuji piloting Super Tengen, the less and less likely it seems, as not only are sorcerers said to most likely be immune to this merger, but also Yuji is a player in the Culling Games, and he would have to be dead. And while post-mortem cursed energy is something that we've already talked about over the duration of this battle against Sukuna, to assume that that cursed energy would be involved in Super Tengen is kind of a stretch. And since every Jujutsu sorcerer that's battled against Sukuna has been killed with a Jujutsu technique, the chances of them turning into curses after their death and coming back to battle against Sukuna is small. So chapters like this, while they were exciting, have left the entirety of the fandom kind of scratching their head, asking the incredibly logical question, are we still doing this? But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that chapter 256 is going to head the story in the same direction that it's been heading this entire time? Or do you have faith that somehow the stragglers of the Kusakabe coalition, the presumed last line of defense, will find a way to defeat Sukuna? Do you believe that the Sukuna cycle is killing the story, or do you believe that the balls required to write the ending of your story like this is actually making JJK an even more enjoyable and unique experience? Tell me in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. At the beginning of this video, I was like, man, I love the direction that Gege's going into. It's brutal, it's new, it's unique, but the more I talk about it, the angrier I get.